Miss Eleanor Hartley had always believed her thoughts were her own, a sanctuary no one could breach. But on a rain-soaked November evening in 1818, her leather-bound diary slipped from her trembling hands in the Duke of Ashford's library. By morning, it rested on his Grace's mahogany desk. As he turned the final page, his breath caught. The last line, written in her careful script, revealed a truth so devastating it would shatter the carefully constructed walls of Ashford Manor forever. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The autumn of 1818 arrived at Ashford Manor with its customary elegance, golden leaves drifting across manicured lawns, the scent of wood smoke curling from chimneys, and the rigid expectations of English aristocracy settling like frost upon every surface. Miss Eleanor Hartley, governess to the Duke of Ashford's two young nieces, had learned to move through these grand halls like a shadow, present but unnoticed. Essential, yet invisible. At 23, Eleanor possessed a quiet beauty that her station demanded she conceal. Her chestnut hair was always swept into a severe knot, her grey dresses buttoned to the throat, her hazel eyes carefully downcast in the presence of her betters. She had arrived at Ashford Manor 6 months prior, grateful for the position that saved her from destitution after her father's death left her penniless and alone. The manor itself was a testament to centuries of Ashford power, sprawling wings of honey-coloured stone, portraits of stern ancestors lining every corridor, and an atmosphere of unassailable privilege that permeated even the servants' quarters. Eleanor's small room in the east wing was sparse but clean, containing only a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a single window overlooking the estate's vast parkland. Her charges, Lady Beatrice and Lady Constance, aged 9 and 7 respectively, were bright, curious girls whose mother had died in childbirth and whose father, the Duke's younger brother, had perished in a hunting accident 2 years hence. The Duke, their guardian, was a distant figure in their lives, appearing only occasionally at breakfast or in the evening drawing room, his attention consumed by estate matters and his position in Parliament. Eleanor had seen His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, only a handful of times in close quarters. Lord William Ashford was 38, tall and imposing, with dark hair silvering at the temples and grey eyes that seemed to assess everything with cool calculation. He was known throughout the county as a fair but exacting landlord, a man of impeccable breeding who had never married despite considerable pressure from society and his family. Rumours suggested he had loved once in his youth, but the lady had married another, leaving him permanently disinclined toward matrimony. The household was managed with military precision by Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, a formidable woman who had served the Ashfords for 30 years. She maintained strict hierarchies below stairs, ensuring that governesses like Eleanor occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, too educated to dine with servants, too lowly to join the family. Eleanor's days followed an unvarying pattern. She rose at 6, breakfasted alone in the schoolroom, and spent mornings teaching her charges literature, history, French, and mathematics. Afternoons were devoted to music, drawing, and needlework. Evenings, after the girls were abed, belonged to her alone, precious hours when she could read, think, and write in her diary. The diary had been her father's final gift, presented on her 20th birthday with trembling hands and the prescient knowledge that his illness would soon claim him. "Write your truth, Eleanor," he had whispered. "In a world that will demand you diminish yourself, remember who you truly are." And so she wrote. Not the mundane details of lessons and weather, but her observations, her thoughts, her secret longings. She wrote about the injustice of a society that valued birth over merit, that condemned intelligent women to lives of dependence. She wrote about the books she read in stolen moments, radical philosophy, poetry that stirred her soul, novels that transported her beyond Ashford's walls. And though she barely admitted it to herself, she wrote about the Duke. It had begun innocently enough, noting his kindness when he praised Beatrice's watercolour, observing his patience when Constance peppered him with questions about Parliament. But gradually, her entries grew more revealing. She noticed how his stern expression softened when he thought himself unobserved, how his rare smiles transformed his austere features, how his voice carried a warmth when speaking of estate improvements that benefited his tenants. Eleanor knew such thoughts were dangerous, foolish beyond measure. The Duke of Ashford existed in a realm as distant from her own as the stars. Yet in the privacy of her diary, she allowed herself to imagine, what if circumstances were different? What if she were a gentleman's daughter, properly dowered and presented? What if he saw her not as a servant, but as a woman? The household's rhythm was disrupted in late October by the arrival of Lady Arabella Thornton and her daughter, Miss Charlotte Thornton. Lady Arabella was a distant cousin of the late Duchess and had maintained a correspondence with the Duke regarding estate matters. Charlotte, at 21, was everything Eleanor was not: golden-haired, exquisitely dressed, accomplished in all the arts that mattered to society, and possessed of a dowry substantial enough to tempt even a duke. From the moment of their arrival, the manor's atmosphere shifted. Lady Arabella commandeered the best guest chambers, reorganized the drawing-room arrangements to her liking, and inserted herself into every aspect of household management, much to Mrs. Pemberton's barely concealed irritation. Charlotte, meanwhile, pursued the Duke with a determination that would have been unseemly in a less beautiful woman. Eleanor observed it all from her marginal position. She watched Charlotte's calculated laughter at the Duke's remarks, her artful displays of accomplishment at the pianoforte, her strategic appearances in the library when His Grace worked there in the evenings. The Duke, for his part, seemed politely receptive but not particularly engaged, until Lady Arabella began speaking of her late husband's connection to the Prince Regent and the advantageous political alliances such a marriage could secure. The girls, sensitive to household tensions, grew restless and difficult. Beatrice asked pointed questions about why Miss Thornton was always present at dinner, while Constance openly declared she didn't like that yellow-haired lady who talks too much. Eleanor soothed them with stories and extra attention, but privately she felt the walls of her golden cage closing in. She had no claim on the Duke's attention, no right to the jealousy that burned in her chest when Charlotte touched his arm or smiled up at him with practiced coquetry. She was a governess, a nobody, a woman whose opinions and feelings mattered to no one. In her diary, she poured out her frustration and heartache. She wrote of the fundamental unfairness of a world where Charlotte's beauty and connections mattered more than character or intelligence. She wrote of her growing, impossible feelings for a man she could never have. And in moments of despair, she wrote of her fear that she would spend her entire life in such liminal spaces, neither servant nor family, neither valued nor entirely dismissed, watching life happen to others while her own remained forever constrained. The first week of November brought storms that lashed the manor's windows and turned the parkland to mud. The Duke announced that he would host a grand ball in 3 weeks' time, ostensibly to celebrate the completion of renovations to the manor's ballroom, but everyone understood its true purpose. Lady Arabella's satisfied smile and Charlotte's triumphant glances made it clear. An engagement announcement was expected. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. She knew she should be happy for His Grace, should wish him well in securing his lineage and position. Instead, she felt only a profound, aching loss for something she had never possessed and never could. On the evening of November 7th, after a particularly trying day, when Charlotte had condescended to visit the schoolroom and criticize Eleanor's teaching methods, she retreated to the library. It was late, past 10 o'clock, and she believed herself alone. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. Eleanor curled into her favorite chair in the corner, hidden from casual view, and opened her diary. Her hand shook as she wrote, tears blurring her vision. She wrote of her love, there she finally named it, for a man who would never see her as anything but a servant. She wrote of her despair at watching him be claimed by a woman who valued his title more than his character. And finally, in a moment of raw honesty, she wrote the truth she had been avoiding for months. She was not merely heartbroken, she was ruined, not in body, but in spirit. She could never love another, never accept the kind of match her station might afford, a tradesman perhaps, or a clerk, because her heart belonged irrevocably to the Duke of Ashford. The admission exhausted her. She closed the diary, intending to return to her room, but the warmth of the dying fire and the emotional toll of the day overcame her. Her eyes drifted closed. She woke with a start to the sound of the library door opening. Panic seized her. It was forbidden for governesses to use the family rooms after hours. She shrank back into the shadows, praying whoever had entered would not notice her presence. But in her haste to remain hidden, her diary slipped from her lap, landing with a soft thud on the carpet. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering, as footsteps approached her corner. The Duke of Ashford stood before her, candle in hand, his expression startled. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, he in his shirt sleeves, clearly having thought himself alone, and she in her plain grey dress, caught where she had no right to be. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "I did not expect to find anyone here at this hour." Eleanor rose quickly, her face burning with humiliation. "Your Grace, I apologize. I came to return a book and I fell asleep. It was improper. I will return to my quarters immediately." She moved to pass him, desperate to escape, but her foot caught on the diary lying on the floor. She stumbled, and the Duke's hand shot out to steady her, his fingers warm through the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Are you hurt?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "No, Your Grace. Thank you. I'm perfectly well." She pulled away from his touch as though burned, snatched up what she thought was her diary in the dim light, and fled the library without another word, leaving the Duke standing alone in the shadows, a small leather-bound book lying forgotten at his feet. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, mortified by her encounter with the Duke, replaying every moment of her graceless exit from the library. It was only as dawnlight crept through her window that she reached for her diary to record her tumultuous thoughts, and realized with dawning horror that the book on her nightstand was not her diary at all, but a volume of Wordsworth's poetry from the library, which meant her diary, containing every private thought and feeling she had ever committed to paper, was still in the library. Or worse, the Duke had found it. She dressed with shaking hands, her mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps it had slid under furniture, unnoticed. Perhaps a maid had found it and, unable to read, had simply placed it aside. Perhaps, but even as she tried to convince herself, Eleanor knew the truth in her bones. The Duke had her diary. He would read it. And when he did, her position at Ashford Manor would be finished. She moved through the morning's lessons mechanically, her stomach churning with anxiety. Beatrice asked twice if she was feeling ill, and even young Constance seemed subdued by her governess's distraction. Eleanor kept expecting a summons from Mrs. Pemberton, a cold dismissal, instructions to pack her belongings. But the morning passed without incident. Then the afternoon. By evening, Eleanor began to hope that perhaps the Duke had been too occupied with his guests to examine a stray book found in the library. Perhaps he had simply handed it to a servant to return to its proper place. The hope was short-lived. At 7 o'clock, as Eleanor was preparing the girls for bed, a footman appeared at the schoolroom door. "Miss Hartley, His Grace requests your presence in the drawing-room." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "Now?" "Yes, miss. The family is gathering before dinner." The family, which meant not only the Duke, but Lady Arabella and Charlotte as well. Eleanor's hands trembled as she smoothed her dress and checked her appearance in the small mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes too bright with unshed tears. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman facing her doom. The drawing room blazed with candlelight and fire, a warm, elegant space that had never felt less welcoming. The Duke stood by the mantelpiece, still in his riding clothes, suggesting he had only recently returned from the estate. Lady Arabella occupied the best chair, her posture radiating satisfaction. Charlotte stood beside her mother, a small, cruel smile playing at her lips. Eleanor entered and curtsied, keeping her eyes lowered. "Your Grace, you wish to see me." "Miss Hartley." The Duke's voice was strange, tight, controlled, as though he were holding back some powerful emotion. "Lady Arabella has brought a matter to my attention that requires clarification." Eleanor's gaze flicked to Lady Arabella, whose expression was one of barely concealed triumph. Dread pooled in her stomach. "It seems," the Duke continued, "that a diary was discovered in the library this morning, a diary containing observations about members of this household." So it had happened. Someone, a maid perhaps, or Lady Arabella herself, had found the diary and brought it to the Duke's attention. Or worse, he had read it himself and shared its contents with his guests. Eleanor wanted to sink through the floor, to disappear entirely. Instead, she forced herself to stand straight, to meet this humiliation with what dignity she could muster. "The diary is mine, Your Grace." "We know it's yours," Charlotte interjected, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Your name is written inside the cover. What we want to know is how you dare to harbor such inappropriate feelings for your betters." Heat flooded Eleanor's face. They had read it. They knew everything. Lady Arabella leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "It is one thing for a governess to be grateful for her position, Miss Hartley. It is quite another to develop romantic delusions about the master of the house. Such presumption is not only inappropriate, it is disturbing." "I never acted on any—" Eleanor began, but Lady Arabella cut her off. "You wrote pages upon pages of your feelings for his Grace. You criticized Miss Thornton, a lady of quality, suggesting she was unworthy of the Duke's attention. You questioned the very foundations of society that provide you with employment and shelter. These are not the thoughts of a proper, grateful servant." Eleanor's humiliation was complete. Every private thought, every moment of vulnerability had been exposed and weaponized against her. She looked at the Duke, hoping for some sign of understanding, but his expression was unreadable, his jaw tight. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I apologize for any offense my private thoughts may have caused. They were never meant to be read by anyone. I will, of course, leave Ashford Manor immediately." "Leave?" Charlotte laughed, the sound sharp and unkind. "Oh, Miss Hartley, it's not quite that simple. You see, such scandalous writings cannot simply be swept away with a quiet departure. What if you were to go to another household and develop similar obsessions? What if you were to spread gossip about what you observed here?" "I would never—" "We have only your word for that," Lady Arabella said coldly, "and given the evidence of your diary, your word seems rather unreliable. No, I think it's best if His Grace provides you with a character reference that reflects the truth of your conduct. Future employers should know exactly what kind of woman they would be bringing into their homes." The meaning was clear. With such a reference, Eleanor would never secure another position as a governess. She would be unemployable in any respectable household. Without family or funds, she would be forced into factory work, or worse, the streets. Eleanor swayed slightly, the room tilting around her. This was not merely dismissal. This was destruction. "That seems excessive," the Duke said suddenly, his voice cutting through the women's satisfied murmurs. Miss Hartley's thoughts, however inappropriate, resulted in no actual misconduct. "She has been an excellent governess to my nieces." Lady Arabella's expression hardened. "William, surely you cannot mean to be lenient with a woman who has been harboring romantic feelings for you. It's unseemly. It makes a mockery of your position and hers. What would society say if it became known that you allowed such a person to remain in your household?" "What would society say?" the Duke replied, his tone dangerously quiet. about a guest who reads another person's private diary and then publicly humiliates them. Lady Arabella's face flushed. I was protecting your interests. The diary was found by a maid and brought to me as the senior lady in residence. I felt it my duty to inform you of its contents. And you felt it necessary to do so in front of your daughter, to ensure maximum humiliation for Miss Hartley? I felt it necessary to ensure you understood the severity of the situation, Lady Arabella snapped, her composure cracking. This woman has been living under your roof, teaching your nieces, all while harboring completely inappropriate feelings for you. She has criticized Charlotte, a lady of quality who may soon be— She stopped abruptly, but the implication hung in the air. Who may soon be your wife. The Duke's expression grew colder still. I see. This is not about protecting my interests at all, is it, Lady Arabella? This is about removing any potential complication to your plans. I don't know what you mean, Lady Arabella said stiffly. I think you do. The Duke turned to Eleanor, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that might have been regret. Miss Hartley, you are dismissed from your position, effective immediately. You will be provided with 3 months' wages and a neutral character reference, stating that you fulfilled your duties adequately, but that the position was no longer required. That is more than fair. It was more than fair. It was generous even, but it was still the end of everything Eleanor had built since her father's death. She curtsied deeply, not trusting herself to speak. You may go, the Duke said quietly. Eleanor turned to leave. Her vision blurred with tears. She refused to shed in front of these people, but Charlotte's voice stopped her at the door. One more thing, Miss Hartley. That final line in your diary, the one about being ruined in spirit. How terribly dramatic. You should remember that women in your position don't have the luxury of such grand emotions. Leave those to your betters. The cruelty of it, the casual dismissal of her pain as though her feelings mattered less because of her station, broke something in Eleanor. She turned back, and for once she did not lower her eyes. You're right, Miss Thornton, she said, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her face. I don't have the luxury of grand emotions. I don't have the luxury of choosing whom to love or of being loved in return. I don't have the luxury of security or family or a future that holds anything but uncertainty. But I do have one thing you will never possess, the knowledge that my feelings, however inappropriate, were genuine. I loved not for title or fortune, but for the man himself. Can you say the same? The silence that followed was absolute. Charlotte's face went white, then red. Lady Arabella rose from her chair, sputtering with outrage, but Eleanor didn't wait to hear their response. She fled the drawing room, her dignity in tatters, her future in ruins, and her heart shattered beyond repair. Behind her, she didn't see the Duke's expression as he watched her go, a mixture of shock, admiration, and something that might have been anguish. Eleanor spent that night packing her meager belongings, her hands moving automatically, while her mind remained numb with shock and grief. The girls had cried when she told them she was leaving, and their tears had nearly undone her completely. She had promised to write, though she knew such correspondence would likely be forbidden by whoever replaced her. By dawn, her trunk was ready. Mrs. Pemberton appeared at her door, her usually stern face softened with something approaching sympathy. The carriage is ready, Miss Hartley. His Grace has arranged for you to be taken to the coaching inn. He's also— She hesitated, then pressed a small purse into Eleanor's hands. This is more than 3 months' wages. He wanted you to have it. Eleanor stared at the purse, heavy with coins. It was generous beyond measure, enough to sustain her for 6 months, perhaps longer, if she was careful. The Duke's gilt money, she thought bitterly, though even in her pain, she recognized the kindness of the gesture. The journey to London took 2 days. Eleanor had written ahead to her only living relative, her mother's sister, Mrs. Agatha Blackwood, a widow who lived in Bloomsbury, and whom Eleanor had not seen since childhood. The response had been swift and warm. Come at once, child. You are always welcome here. Aunt Agatha's townhouse was narrow but elegant, tucked into a quiet square where plane trees provided shade, and the noise of London's busier streets seemed distant. Agatha herself was 60 years of age, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for eccentricity that had only grown since her husband's death freed her from society's more stringent expectations. She took one look at Eleanor's pale, exhausted face and drew her into a fierce embrace. "Come in, my dear. You look half dead. We'll have tea, and then you'll tell me everything." Over the following days, Eleanor did exactly that. She told Agatha about her position at Ashford Manor, about the Duke and her impossible feelings, about the diary and the terrible scene in the drawing room. She expected judgment, or at least gentle chiding about the impropriety of her emotions. Instead, Agatha listened with keen attention, occasionally asking pointed questions, and when Eleanor finished, she said simply, "What a nest of vipers! That Thornton woman sounds perfectly dreadful, and the Duke, for all his generosity with wages, behaved like a coward." "He was in an impossible position," Eleanor found herself defending him. "Lady Arabella is a connection of his family, and Charlotte is a mercenary in silk skirts," Agatha interrupted. "And the Duke, if he had any backbone, would have sent them packing the moment they began tormenting you. But men of his class rarely do they? They're so concerned with propriety and avoiding scandal that they sacrifice the people who matter least in society's eyes." Eleanor had never heard anyone speak so bluntly about the aristocracy. "Aunt Agatha, you shouldn't what? Speak the truth. My dear girl, one of the few advantages of being an old widow with an independent income is that I can say what I please. And what I please to say is that you have been treated abominably, and you deserve better." Over the following weeks, Agatha set about proving that assertion. She introduced Eleanor to her circle of friends, an eclectic mix of blue-stockings, reformers, artists, and intellectuals who gathered regularly in Agatha's drawing room to discuss everything from politics to poetry. There were women who had published novels under male pseudonyms, men who advocated for workers' rights, scholars who challenged conventional thinking about history and science. Eleanor, accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of Ashford Manor, found herself in a world where ideas mattered more than birth, where her intelligence was not something to hide, but to celebrate. A Mrs. Henrietta Dalton, who had written 3 well-received novels, encouraged Eleanor to try her hand at writing. A Mr. James Whitmore, a journalist for a progressive newspaper, engaged her in spirited debates about social reform. And then there was Dr. Elias Reid. Dr. Reid was a physician who had trained in Edinburgh and now ran a charitable clinic in one of London's poorer districts. He was 32 years of age, tall and lean, with dark auburn hair and green eyes that held both intelligence and compassion. He had grown up in Yorkshire, the son of a country doctor, and had worked his way to his position through scholarship and determination rather than family connection. He first appeared at one of Agatha's gatherings in early December, arriving late and apologizing for the mud on his boots. He had come directly from the clinic. Eleanor, helping Agatha serve tea, found herself drawn into conversation with him about the health conditions in London's slums. "The greatest problem is not disease itself, but the conditions that breed it," he said, his voice passionate. "Overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition. We treat the symptoms, but the causes remain unaddressed because those with power to change things never witness the suffering firsthand." "And if they did witness it," Eleanor asked, "would they care?" Dr. Reid smiled, a warm expression that transformed his serious face. "Some would. I have to believe that, or I couldn't continue the work. There are people of conscience in every class, Miss Hartley. The challenge is connecting them to the problems that need solving." And over the following weeks, Dr. Reid became a regular presence at Agatha's gatherings, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to his arrival, to the conversations that challenged her thinking and made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life. He treated her not as a governess or a charity case, but as an intellectual equal, someone whose opinions mattered. He spoke to her about his work, about the children he treated who reminded him why medicine mattered. She told him about teaching Beatrice and Constance, about the joy of watching young minds develop. They discovered a shared love of poetry, a mutual frustration with social inequities, and a similar sense of humor that made their conversations as enjoyable as they were stimulating. Agatha watched their growing friendship with satisfaction. "That young man is quite taken with you," she observed one evening after Dr. Reed had departed. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "We're friends, Aunt. Nothing more. For now, perhaps, but Eleanor, you must understand, Dr. Reed is not the Duke of Ashford. He's a man who would value you for yourself, not despite your station, but because of who you are. That's worth more than any title." Eleanor knew her aunt was right. Dr. Reed was everything the Duke was not: accessible, warm, unencumbered by the weight of aristocratic expectation. And yet her treacherous heart still ached when she thought of Ashford Manor, of grey eyes and rare smiles, of a man she could never have. In mid-December, Eleanor accompanied Dr. Reed to his clinic, helping to distribute winter coats and blankets donated by Agatha's circle. The poverty she witnessed shocked her. Families crowded into single rooms, children with hollow eyes and persistent coughs, women aged beyond their years by hardship. "This is England too," Dr. Reed said quietly, watching her face. "Not the England of country estates and London ballrooms, but England nonetheless. These people matter just as much as dukes and duchesses. But society has decided otherwise." Eleanor thought of Ashford Manor's vast, empty rooms, of the elaborate dinners served to a handful of people while families starved miles away. "It's not right," she whispered. "No," Dr. Reed agreed. "It's not. But people like us, we can make a difference even if it's small. Every child we treat, every family we help, it matters." As they worked side by side that day, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The pain of losing her position, of her humiliation, began to transform into something else. A determination to build a life of purpose, to matter in ways that transcended society's narrow definitions. That evening, as Dr. Reed walked her back to Agatha's townhouse through the cold December streets, he said, "Miss Hartley, Eleanor, if I may, I want you to know how much I admire you. Your intelligence, your compassion, your resilience. You've faced considerable hardship, and yet you've emerged with your spirit intact. That's remarkable." Eleanor looked up at him, at his earnest face illuminated by gaslight, and felt a flutter of something that might, in time, become more than friendship. "Thank you, Dr. Reed. That means a great deal." "Elias," he said softly. "My friends call me Elias." "Elias," she repeated and smiled, a genuine smile, the first in weeks. As December progressed, Eleanor began to feel the first tentative stirrings of hope. She was writing again, not in a diary, but in essays that Mrs. Dalton encouraged her to submit to progressive journals. She was useful, helping at Dr. Reed's clinic twice a week. She was surrounded by people who valued her mind and her character. And yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and she lay alone in her comfortable bed in Agatha's guest room, she still thought of the Duke. She wondered if he had married Charlotte, if Beatrice and Constance had a new governess, if he ever thought of the woman who had loved him foolishly and lost everything. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was building a new life, one that didn't include impossible dreams of a man she could never have. But the heart, Eleanor was learning, did not always listen to reason, and some losses, no matter how inevitable, left scars that never fully healed. Christmas approached, bringing with it invitations to various gatherings among Agatha's circle. Eleanor accepted them all, determined to embrace this new life fully. And when Elias Reed asked if she might accompany him to a medical society lecture followed by dinner, she said yes, recognizing it for what it was, not merely friendship, but the beginning of courtship. She was moving forward. She was healing. And if her heart still belonged to a duke who had never truly been hers, well, perhaps in time, that too would change. The new year of 1819 arrived with bitter cold and crystalline skies. London society, having retreated to country estates for Christmas, returned to the capital in force, bringing with it the usual round of balls, soirees, and cultural events that marked the season's beginning. Agatha, who maintained connections across London's social strata despite her unconventional circle, secured invitations to a benefit concert at the Hanover Square Rooms in mid-January. The event, organised to raise funds for a new charitable hospital, would attract both progressive reformers and traditional aristocracy, a rare mixing of worlds. "You should attend," Agatha told Eleanor firmly. "It's time you stopped hiding. You've done nothing wrong, and I won't have you living like a recluse because some spiteful woman humiliated you." Eleanor hesitated. The thought of encountering members of the ton, of facing potential gossip or recognition, filled her with dread. But Agatha was insistent, and Elias, when he learned of the invitation, offered to escort them both. "I'll be there representing the clinic," he explained. "We're hoping to secure donations from some of the wealthier attendees. It would be a pleasure to have your company." And so Eleanor found herself, on a cold January evening, dressed in a gown Agatha had insisted on purchasing, a deep sapphire silk that brought out the colour of her eyes and fit her slender figure beautifully. Her hair was dressed in a softer style than she had worn at Ashford Manor, with curls framing her face. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognised herself. "You look like a lady, not a governess," Agatha said with satisfaction. "Which is precisely as it should be. Your father was a gentleman, Eleanor, even if he died without fortune. You have every right to hold your head high in any company." The Hanover Square Rooms blazed with light and elegance. The concert hall was filled with London's elite, glittering in jewels and fine evening dress. Eleanor felt her courage wavering as they entered, but Elias's steady presence at her side and Agatha's firm grip on her arm kept her moving forward. They found seats in the upper gallery, which provided an excellent view of both the stage and the audience below. As the orchestra tuned their instruments, Eleanor scanned the crowd, part of her dreading and part of her hoping to see a familiar face. And then she saw him. The Duke of Ashford sat in a box near the stage, his dark evening clothes impeccable, his posture radiating the unconscious authority of his class. Beside him sat Lady Arabella and Charlotte, the latter resplendent in pink silk and diamonds, her hand resting possessively on the Duke's arm. Eleanor's breath caught. 2 months had passed since that terrible night in the drawing-room, but seeing him again brought every emotion flooding back. Love, humiliation, longing, anger. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the programme in her hands, but her awareness of his presence coloured everything. The concert began, a programme of Handel and Mozart that should have been transporting. Eleanor heard barely a note. She was too conscious of the Duke below, of Charlotte's proprietary gestures, of the way Lady Arabella surveyed the audience with satisfaction, as though the Duke's presence beside her daughter confirmed some victory. During the interval, Agatha steered them toward the reception room, where refreshments were served and donations solicited. Elias was immediately engaged by several potential benefactors, discussing the clinic's work with passionate eloquence. Eleanor stood slightly apart, accepting a glass of wine and trying to appear composed. "Eleanor? Miss Hartley?" She turned to find Lady Beatrice and Lady Constance standing before her, their faces alight with joy. Behind them stood their new governess, a severe-looking woman in her 40s who regarded Eleanor with suspicion. "Lady Beatrice, Lady Constance," Eleanor said, her heart swelling at the sight of them. "How wonderful to see you." "We've missed you so much," Constance cried, forgetting decorum entirely and throwing her arms around Eleanor's waist. "Our new governess is horrid. She never tells stories, and she raps our knuckles with a ruler when we make mistakes." "Ah, Constance," the new governess hissed. "That is quite enough. Come away at once." But Beatrice, older and more aware of social nuances, held her ground. "Miss Hartley, are you well? We heard you left to care for a sick relative, but we worried." Eleanor's throat tightened. So the girls had been told a lie to spare them the truth. I'm very well, Lady Beatrice. I'm living in London with my aunt now. Will you come back to Ashford? Constance asked hopefully. I'm afraid not, dear one. But I think of you both often. Miss Hartley. The Duke's voice, low and controlled, made Eleanor's spine stiffen. She turned slowly to find him standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Charlotte clung to his arm, her eyes narrowing as she took in Eleanor's transformed appearance. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, curtsying with precise correctness. "Miss Thornton." "You look well," the Duke said, and there was something in his voice, surprise, regret, that Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "London agrees with you." "It does, Your Grace. I found the city most enlightening." Charlotte's grip on the Duke's arm tightened. "How nice that you've landed on your feet, Miss Hartley. One does worry about young women in your position. So easy to fall into unfortunate circumstances." The implication was clear and insulting. Before Eleanor could respond, Elias appeared at her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "Eleanor, Lord Pemberton wishes to discuss the clinic's work. Will you introduce us?" He turned to the Duke with polite acknowledgement. "Your Grace, ladies." The Duke's gaze fixed on Elias, taking in his position at Eleanor's side, the easy familiarity of his use of her Christian name. Something flickered in those grey eyes, surprise and perhaps something darker. "Dr. Reed," Agatha said, appearing on Eleanor's other side like a protective lioness. "This is the Duke of Ashford. Your Grace, Dr. Elias Reed runs a charitable clinic in Whitechapel. He's doing remarkable work among the poor." "A physician," the Duke said, his tone carefully neutral. "A noble profession." "I find it fulfilling," Elias replied, "though I imagine managing a great estate provides its own challenges and satisfactions." Indeed, the Duke's attention returned to Eleanor. "Miss Hartley, I trust you received the wages I sent." "I did, Your Grace. You were most generous. It was the least I could do given the circumstances of your departure." Charlotte made a small, disdainful sound. "Really, William, must we discuss such matters here? Miss Hartley has clearly moved on to greener pastures." Her gaze raked over Elias with barely concealed contempt. "Or perhaps more modest ones." Elias stiffened, but before he could respond, Eleanor spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Dr. Reed's work saves lives every day, Miss Thornton. I consider it an honor to assist him. But then, I suppose those of us who must actually work for our living have a different perspective on what constitutes value." The barb hit home. Charlotte's face flushed, and Lady Arabella, who had joined the group, drew herself up with outrage. "How dare you speak to Miss Thornton in such a manner? Have you forgotten your place entirely?" "On the contrary," Eleanor replied. "I've finally remembered it. If you'll excuse us, we have people to meet who are interested in doing actual good in the world." She turned away, Elias and Agatha flanking her, and walked back into the reception room with her head high. Behind her, she heard Constance's piping voice. "I like Miss Hartley's new friends better than Miss Thornton." Despite her bravado, Eleanor was shaking. Agatha guided her to a quiet corner and pressed a glass of wine into her hands. "Well done, my dear. That was magnificent." "I shouldn't have said those things," Eleanor whispered. "I was rude." "You were honest," Elias corrected gently, "and that woman deserved far worse." The Duke, however, he paused, studying Eleanor's face. "There's history there, isn't there?" "More than you've told us." Eleanor met his kind, perceptive gaze and knew she owed him the truth. "Yes, but it's in the past, Elias. I promise you that." He nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "The past has a way of lingering, Eleanor, but I hope—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "I hope you know that your future could be very different from your past, if you wished it." Before Eleanor could respond, they were interrupted by Lord Pemberton, eager to discuss the clinic's funding needs. The rest of the interval passed in a blur of introductions and conversations, but Eleanor remained acutely aware of the Duke's presence across the room, of his gaze returning to her again and again. When the concert resumed, Eleanor found it impossible to concentrate. Her mind replayed the encounter, analyzing every word, every look. The Duke had seemed, what? Surprised, regretful, or merely uncomfortable at encountering a former servant in a social setting. And Charlotte's possessiveness, Lady Arabella's satisfaction, did that mean an engagement was imminent? The thought sent a sharp pain through Eleanor's chest, but she forced herself to breathe through it. She had no claim on the Duke. She never had. As the final notes of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony faded and applause filled the hall, Agatha leaned close to Eleanor. "He couldn't take his eyes off you, you know, the Duke. Every time I glanced at his box, he was watching you. You're imagining things," Eleanor murmured. "I'm 70 years old, my dear. My eyes may be failing, but my perception is sharp as ever. That man looked at you like a drowning man looks at shore." Eleanor shook her head, unwilling to let hope take root. "It doesn't matter, Aunt. Even if he felt something, which I doubt, his world and mine are too far apart." "Are they?" Agatha asked softly. "You're a gentleman's daughter, Eleanor. Your father's lack of fortune doesn't change your birth. And you're here tonight, in the same room, attending the same event. Perhaps the distance isn't as great as you think." But Eleanor knew better. The distance between a duke and a penniless governess was not measured in feet or miles, but in the unbridgeable gulf of social expectation, family obligation, and the weight of centuries of tradition. The Duke would marry Charlotte or someone like her, would produce heirs to carry on the Ashford name, would live out his life in the world he was born to, and Eleanor would build a different life, perhaps with Elias, perhaps alone, but a life of purpose and meaning nonetheless. As they prepared to leave, collecting their cloaks in the entrance hall, Eleanor found herself face to face with the Duke once more. He stood alone, Charlotte and Lady Arabella having gone ahead to their carriage. "Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "might I have a word?" Eleanor glanced at Agatha, who nodded and moved a discreet distance away. Elias, less willing to leave her, remained close enough to intervene if needed. "Your Grace." The Duke seemed to struggle for words, his usual composure cracking. "I wanted to say, that is, I wish to apologize for how things ended at Ashford Manor. You deserved better." Eleanor's heart hammered. "You gave me generous wages and a fair reference, Your Grace. You did more than most would have." "I should have done more, I should have—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Lady Arabella and her daughter were guests in my home. I allowed them to treat you abominably. I allowed you to be humiliated when you had done nothing wrong. I wrote inappropriate things about you in my diary," Eleanor said quietly. "That was wrong. Having private thoughts is not wrong, Miss Hartley. Having them exposed and weaponized against you, that was the wrong. And I stood by and let it happen because I was too concerned with propriety, with avoiding scandal." His grey eyes met hers, and in them she saw genuine regret. "I've thought about that night many times since, about what I should have said, should have done, about how I failed you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Your Grace, please don't—" "William!" Charlotte's voice, sharp and imperious, cut through the moment. She stood in the entrance, her expression thunderous. "The carriage is waiting. We'll be late for Lady Pemberton's supper." The Duke's expression shuttered, the moment of vulnerability vanishing behind aristocratic reserve. "Of course. Forgive me, Miss Hartley. I've detained you long enough. I wish you well." He bowed and turned away, returning to Charlotte's side. Eleanor watched him go, her heart aching with renewed force. For a moment, she had seen the man behind the title, the man who regretted, who felt, who might have been something more than duty and obligation. But Charlotte's hand was already on his arm, already pulling him back into the world where he belonged. And Eleanor was left standing in the entrance hall, Elias's concerned gaze on her face, and Agatha's knowing expression telling her that her aunt had seen everything. "Come, my dear," Agatha said gently. "Let's go home." As their carriage pulled away from the Hanover Square rooms, Eleanor looked back once to see the Duke's carriage departing in the opposite direction, carrying him toward his future, a future that would never include her. But for the first time, the thought didn't destroy her. It hurt, yes, but she was still standing, still moving forward. And that, she realized, was its own kind of victory. February arrived with unseasonable warmth, bringing early crocuses to London squares and a sense of renewal to the city. For Eleanor, the month brought changes that would reshape her future entirely. Elias Reed had become a constant presence in her life. He called at Agatha's townhouse 3 times a week, ostensibly to discuss the clinic's work, but increasingly to simply spend time with Eleanor. They walked in the parks, attended lectures, visited bookshops, and talked for hours about everything from medical ethics to poetry to their dreams for the future. Agatha watched their courtship with approval. "He's a good man, Eleanor. Solid, principled, and he adores you. You could do far worse." Eleanor knew it was true. Elias was everything she should want, kind, intelligent, passionate about meaningful work, and clearly devoted to her. When he looked at her, she saw genuine affection and respect. When he spoke of the future, she heard plans that included her as an equal partner, not an ornament or a servant. And yet, her heart remained stubbornly attached to a man she could never have. The crisis came in mid-February, when Elias invited Eleanor to dinner at a small, elegant restaurant near Covent Garden. Over wine and roasted lamb, he spoke about the clinic's expansion plans, about a new position he had been offered at a teaching hospital, about his hope to make a real difference in medical education. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about the future a great deal lately, about what I want my life to look like and who I want to share it with." His green eyes were earnest, nervous. "I know we've known each other only a few months, but I feel I know you better than people I've known for years. You're intelligent, compassionate, brave, everything I could want in a partner." Eleanor's heart began to race. She knew what was coming, and she wasn't sure she was ready. "I'm not a wealthy man," Elias continued. "I can't offer you a grand estate or a title, but I can offer you a life of purpose, a partnership of equals, and my complete devotion. Eleanor Hartley, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal hung in the air between them. Eleanor looked at this good, decent man who loved her, who offered her security and respect and a meaningful life. She thought of the alternative, remaining alone, always wondering what might have been with the Duke, nursing a hopeless love for a man who belonged to another world. "Elias," she began, her voice unsteady, "I'm honored, truly. You're one of the best men I've ever known." But, he prompted gently, reading her hesitation, "but I need to be honest with you. My heart—" She stopped, struggling for words. "I care for you deeply, but there's someone else. Not in reality, but in my heart. And I don't know if I can give you what you deserve when part of me still belongs to someone I can never have." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her hand. "The Duke," he said finally. "I suspected as much. The way you looked at him at the concert, the way he looked at you, there's something unfinished there." "There's nothing to finish," Eleanor said firmly. "He's engaged, or soon will be, to Miss Thornton. He lives in a world I'll never be part of. What I feel for him is foolish and pointless. But it's real," Elias said. "And Eleanor, I won't marry you if your heart belongs to someone else. You deserve to be certain, and so do I." Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I don't want to lose you, Elias. You're important to me. And you're important to me, which is why I'm going to give you time." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not withdrawing my proposal, Eleanor, but I'm not demanding an immediate answer either. Take the time you need to sort out your feelings, and know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it." They parted that evening with an embrace that felt both comforting and melancholy. Eleanor returned to Agatha's townhouse in turmoil, her mind a chaos of conflicting emotions. Agatha, perceptive as always, took one look at her face and poured them both generous glasses of sherry. "He proposed, didn't he?" Eleanor nodded, sinking into a chair by the fire. "And I couldn't say yes, not honestly, because I'm still in love with the Duke, even though it's hopeless and foolish and entirely human," Agatha finished. My dear, you can't force your heart to feel what it doesn't feel, but you also can't live your life waiting for something that will never happen. I know that, Eleanor said miserably, but how do I stop loving him? How do I let go? Eleanor knew her aunt was right. As long as the Duke remained unmarried, as long as some small, irrational part of her harbored hope, she would never be free to choose her own future. The opportunity for closure came sooner than expected. In late February, an invitation arrived at Agatha's townhouse, an invitation to the Duke of Ashford's engagement ball, to be held at his London residence in Mayfair on the 1st of March. Eleanor stared at the heavy cream cardstock, at the elegant script announcing the Duke's betrothal to Miss Charlotte Thornton. Her hands trembled as she read it. "Why would he invite us?" she whispered. "After everything?" Agatha examined the invitation with interest. "Perhaps because he's a man of conscience who regrets how you were treated, or perhaps because he wants you to see that he's moved on, to give you the same closure you need. Either way, we're going. Aunt Agatha, I can't." "You can, and you will. You'll attend that ball with your head held high, you'll congratulate the happy couple with grace and dignity, and you'll prove to yourself and to him that you've survived, that you're thriving even. And then, my dear, you'll be free to make your own choice about Dr. Reed." Eleanor wanted to refuse, to avoid the pain of watching the Duke pledge himself to Charlotte, but she recognized the wisdom in Agatha's words. She needed to see it, to make it real, to finally let go. The week leading up to the ball passed in a haze of preparation. Agatha insisted on a new gown, pale gold silk that made Eleanor's skin glow and her eyes luminous. A maid dressed her hair in an elaborate style, threaded with seed pearls. When Eleanor looked in the mirror on the evening of the ball, she saw a woman transformed, elegant, poised, beautiful in a way she had never allowed herself to be at Ashford Manor. "Perfect," Agatha declared. "Now remember, you are a gentleman's daughter. You have done nothing wrong, and you have every right to be there. Hold that thought, and you'll be fine." D. Elias, who had been invited to escort them, arrived in evening dress, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern when he saw Eleanor. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. "But are you sure you want to do this?" "No," Eleanor admitted, "but I need to." The Duke's London residence was a magnificent townhouse in Berkeley Square, ablaze with light and filled with the cream of society. As Eleanor, Agatha and Elias ascended the stairs to the ballroom, Eleanor felt her courage wavering. But Agatha's firm grip on one arm and Elias's steady presence on the other kept her moving forward. The ballroom was spectacular, crystal chandeliers, banks of hothouse flowers, an orchestra playing Strauss. And at the far end, receiving guests, stood the Duke and Charlotte, she in white silk and diamonds, he in impeccable black evening dress. Eleanor forced herself to approach them, to join the receiving line, to move inexorably toward the moment she dreaded. When she finally stood before them, Charlotte's eyes widened with malicious pleasure. "Miss Hartley, how unexpected to see you here." "Miss Thornton," Eleanor replied evenly, "Your Grace, please accept my congratulations on your engagement." The Duke's gaze locked with hers, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but a deep, profound sadness that mirrored her own. "Thank you, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm pleased you could attend." There was so much Eleanor wanted to say, so many questions she wanted to ask. "Are you happy? Do you love her? Do you ever think of me?" But this was not the time or place, and she had no right to ask. "I wish you every happiness, Your Grace," she said instead, and curtsied deeply before moving on, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Elias guided her to the edge of the ballroom, where Agatha procured glasses of champagne. "The worst is over," Agatha murmured. "You did beautifully." But Eleanor felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but grief. She had seen the Duke's face, had seen the sadness in his eyes, and it had confirmed what some part of her had always known. He was not happy. He was doing his duty, marrying appropriately, securing his lineage, but he was not happy. And knowing that changed nothing. He was still engaged to Charlotte. He would still marry her, still live out his life as a duke should. Eleanor's feelings, his feelings, none of it mattered in the face of social expectation and family obligation. The evening progressed with excruciating slowness. Eleanor danced with Elias, with several of Agatha's friends, even with a young earl who seemed charmed by her. She smiled, she conversed, she played the part of a woman enjoying a ball, but her awareness never left the Duke. She watched him dance with Charlotte, watched him accept congratulations from friends and family, watched him perform the role of happy bridegroom with the same careful control he brought to everything. It was nearly midnight when Eleanor stepped onto the terrace for air, needing a moment away from the heat and noise and relentless gaiety. The March night was cool, the garden below dark and quiet. She had been there only a few moments when she heard footsteps behind her. Miss Hartley. She turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, alone, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Your Grace, you should return to your guests, to your fiancé." "I know." But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped onto the terrace, closing the door behind him. "I needed to speak with you, to explain." "You owe me no explanations," Eleanor said, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Perhaps not, but I need to give them anyway." He moved closer, and in the moonlight she could see the tension in his face, the struggle in his eyes. "When you left Ashford Manor, I told myself it was for the best, that you would find a better position, a better life, that I had done the right thing by letting you go." "You did," Eleanor whispered. "No, I didn't. I was a coward, Eleanor. I let Lady Arabella and her daughter humiliate you because I was afraid of scandal, afraid of what society would say if I defended a governess against a lady of quality. I chose propriety over justice, and I've regretted it every day since." Eleanor's breath caught at his use of her Christian name. "Your Grace, when I saw you at the concert, so changed, so confident with that doctor at your side, I realized what I'd lost. Not a governess, but a woman of intelligence and courage and genuine feeling, a woman who saw me, not my title, a woman I—" He stopped, his jaw clenching. "A woman you what?" Eleanor asked, barely breathing. "A woman I could have loved," he said quietly, "if I had been brave enough to let myself." The words hung between them, devastating in their honesty. Eleanor felt tears stream down her face. "But you're engaged to Charlotte." "Yes." The single word was heavy with resignation. "Lady Arabella made it clear that if I didn't offer for Charlotte, she would spread rumors about you, about inappropriate conduct at Ashford Manor, about your dismissal being due to moral failings rather than her own malice. She would have destroyed your reputation entirely, made it impossible for you to find any respectable position or make any decent marriage." Eleanor stared at him, shock replacing grief. "You're marrying Charlotte to protect me. I'm marrying Charlotte because I'm a duke, and dukes marry women like Charlotte, because my family expects it, society expects it, and I've spent my entire life meeting expectations. But yes, Lady Arabella's threats were the final push. I couldn't let her destroy you, Eleanor, not when you'd already suffered enough because of my cowardice." "So you're sacrificing yourself," Eleanor said, anger beginning to burn through her sorrow. "You're condemning yourself to a loveless marriage with a woman who values your title more than your character, all to protect my reputation." "What else could I do?" he asked, and for the first time she heard frustration in his voice. "I'm the Duke of Ashford. I can't marry a penniless governess, no matter how much I might wish to. It would cause scandal, would damage my family's standing, would make you the target of vicious gossip and social ostracism. I can't subject you to that." "You can't subject me to it," Eleanor's voice rose, "or you won't risk your own position by defying society's expectations." The Duke flinched, as though she'd struck him. "Perhaps both. I don't know anymore. All I know is that I'm trapped by my own birth, my own title, and there's no escape." Eleanor looked at this man she loved, this man who was choosing duty over happiness, propriety over love, and felt something break inside her. "Then I pity you, Your Grace. Because I may have lost my position, my security, my place in the world, but I'm free. Free to choose my own path, to love whom I wish, to build a life of meaning rather than obligation. And you're the Duke of Ashford, one of the most powerful men in England, and you're more trapped than I ever was." She turned to leave, but his hand caught her arm, gentle but urgent. "Eleanor, please. I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to understand that if circumstances were different—" "But they're not different," Eleanor interrupted, pulling away from his touch. "And they never will be. Goodbye, Your Grace. I hope you find some measure of happiness in your chosen path." She fled the terrace, leaving the Duke standing alone in the moonlight, and made her way back through the ballroom to where Agatha and Elias waited. "I need to leave," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, I need to leave now." They didn't ask questions, simply collected their things and escorted her to their carriage. As they pulled away from Berkeley Square, Eleanor looked back once to see the Duke's townhouse blazing with light and celebration, a monument to duty and expectation and loveless obligation. And she realized with sudden clarity that Agatha had been right. She needed to see this, to understand that the Duke's world and hers were truly incompatible, that his choices, however much they hurt, were his own. She was free. And that freedom, however painful it had been to achieve, was worth more than any title or estate or place in society. "Take me home, Aunt Agatha," she whispered. "I'm ready to move forward now." 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the garden of a modest but charming house in Hampstead, watching the late summer sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. The house belonged to her and Elias, their home, purchased with his savings and her careful investments of the Duke's generous wages. She had accepted Elias's proposal in April, 2 months after the Duke's engagement ball. The decision had not been easy, but it had been right. She loved Elias, not with the desperate, impossible passion she had felt for the Duke, but with something deeper and more sustainable: respect, affection, partnership, and a shared vision of a meaningful life. They had married quietly in May, with only Agatha and a few close friends in attendance. The ceremony had been simple but joyful, and when Elias had kissed her as his wife, Eleanor had felt not the wild excitement of romantic fantasy, but the steady warmth of genuine commitment. Their life together was everything she had hoped for. Elias continued his work at the clinic, now expanded with funding from several wealthy benefactors, impressed by his dedication. Eleanor assisted him 3 days a week, teaching health and hygiene to the neighborhood women and helping to organize charitable distributions of food and clothing. The other days, she wrote, her essays on social reform had been published in several progressive journals, earning her a modest reputation in intellectual circles. She was working on a book, a treatise on education and women's rights that Mrs. Dalton believed would find a publisher. Agatha visited often, delighting in her niece's happiness and offering acerbic commentary on society's latest scandals. She had become a beloved fixture in their home, a bridge between Eleanor's past and present. Eleanor thought of the Duke sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when she sat in her garden and watched the stars emerge. She had heard through Agatha's connections that he had married Charlotte in a grand ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, in late April. They had spent the summer at Ashford Manor, and rumours suggested the new Duchess was already expecting an heir. The news had hurt, but not as much as Eleanor had feared. She had mourned what might have been, had acknowledged the loss, and then had chosen to focus on what was: a good man who loved her, meaningful work, a life of purpose and freedom. She was happy, not in the desperate, all-consuming way of romantic novels, but in the quiet, sustainable way of a life well lived. On this particular evening, Elias found her in the garden as twilight deepened. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "How far I've come," Eleanor said honestly. "A year ago, I was a governess at Ashford Manor, invisible and insignificant. Now I'm here, with you, doing work that matters. It's remarkable, really." "You were never insignificant," Elias murmured. "You just hadn't found the place where you could bloom." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at his kind, intelligent face. "Thank you, Elias, for seeing me, for loving me, for giving me the freedom to be myself." "Thank you," he replied, "for choosing me, for building this life with me. I know I wasn't your first choice, Eleanor, but I hope I'm your best choice." "You are," she said, and meant it. "You absolutely are." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other not through grand passion or dramatic circumstance, but through mutual respect, shared values, and the quiet courage to build something real. But later that night, after Elias had fallen asleep, she lit a candle and broke the seal. The letter was brief, written in the Duke's own hand. "Dear Miss Hartley, Mrs. Reed, I should say, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. I heard of your marriage through mutual acquaintances and wanted to extend my congratulations. Dr. Reed is a fortunate man. I write primarily to inform you that Lady Arabella and her daughter are no longer welcome at Ashford Manor. After my marriage, certain truths came to light about their conduct, not only toward you, but toward others they considered beneath them. I regret that I did not see their true character sooner, and I regret even more that I allowed them to harm you. I also write to tell you that Beatrice and Constance speak of you often and with great affection. Their new governess, while competent, lacks your warmth and creativity. The girls miss you, as do I. I hope you have found the happiness and freedom you deserve. I hope you have built a life of meaning and purpose, and I hope someday you might forgive me for my cowardice and my failures. I remain, with sincere respect and regard." William Ashford. Eleanor read the letter twice, then held it to the candle flame and watched it burn. The Duke's regrets, his apologies, his good wishes, they changed nothing. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. But as she climbed back into bed beside her sleeping husband, she felt a sense of closure settle over her like a benediction. The Duke had acknowledged his mistakes. He had removed the women who had tormented her from his life. He had wished her well. It was enough, more than enough. She had been a humble governess who lost her diary at a grand estate. When the Duke read the last line, "I am ruined, not in body, but in spirit, for I can never love another," he had frozen, had recognized the depth of her feelings and the impossibility of their situation. But Eleanor had been wrong. She was not ruined. She had loved again, differently, but no less truly. She had built a life that mattered, had found her voice and her purpose. She had bloomed where she was planted, and the garden she had cultivated was more beautiful than any she could have imagined in those dark days at Ashford Manor. As sleep claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was not of the Duke or of what might have been. It was of tomorrow, of the clinic patients she would see, the essay she would finish, the life she would continue building with Elias. She had been lost, but now she was found. She had been broken, but now she was whole. And she was, finally and completely free. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your support means everything, and I'd love to know how far Eleanor's journey has traveled. Thank you for listening.